There was a time when the mere whisper of a woman's longing could fracture the glass of propriety, a time when desire, that primal flame, was pressed beneath veils of virtue, hidden in the folds of silence. In this world of locked doors and measured steps, Freud arrived not as a destroyer, but as one who dared to light a single match within the cavern of repression. It is said that Eve reached for the forbidden fruit, not out of sin but of sacred curiosity, longing for wisdom, and Pandora, opening her jar, was not driven by malice but by the ancient hunger to know. In these myths, we glimpse the first silhouettes of feminine desire painted as dangerous, deviant, in need of control. Yet beneath these tales lies something deeper, the psyche's ancient yearning for wholeness. Freud's question, "What does a woman want?" was not the query of a blind man. It was an invocation, an opening of the gate. It was the philosopher's gaze turned toward a wound the world refused to see. He did not cloak female desire in pathology. He uncovered its exile, saw the ways it had been buried beneath centuries of moral frost and patriarchal order. For desire is not merely of the body, it is of the soul. It is the yearning of the feminine archetype to reclaim her voice, her instinct, her place in the sacred dance of life. To ask this question was to risk the ire of those who built their temples on her silence. And so the journey begins not with answers, but with a wound, a forbidden flame that flickers still in the unconscious. The match is struck, the shadows tremble, and the soul leans closer to the heat. For what we exile does not vanish, it waits, smoldering, for the moment when the veils are lifted and the forgotten fire is remembered. That there are mirrors that do not reflect, there are voices that echo only in dreams. In the long corridors of the Victorian age, a profound hush had fallen upon the feminine soul. It was not merely the body that was veiled in fabric and decorumed, but the psyche itself was draped in frost. Woman was taught not to know her own hunger, not to trust the tremors of her heart, not to speak the language of longing. Her ego, shaped by the rigid molds of the time, was carved to mirror the masculine ideal, polite, restrained, obedient. And beneath this reflection, deep within the well of the unconscious, the Animus slept, not dead, only frozen, waiting. Beneath layers of collective amnesia, beneath the centuries of ought and should, Freud entered this hush not as a hero, but as one who listened. His questions were unsettling because they broke the silence. They pulled at the tightly woven veils, asking what had long been forbidden. What does a woman want? Not what she was told to want, not what served the order of men, but what her soul, in its wild, unspoken core, desired. This was no simple matter of sexuality, it was archetypal. For to deny female desire was to deny the very principle of Eros, the life force itself. It was to fracture the sacred balance between masculine and feminine, between the Animus and Anima within the collective soul of the culture. And so, in parlors lined with lace, behind faces of porcelain calm, the feminine self remained mute. The mirror refused to speak. The image looked back, but the voice was gone. Yet in dreams, in tremors of the body, in sudden tears that had no name, fragments of the soul still stirred. The unconscious remembered what the ego had forgotten. The silenced voice waited for the one who would listen, not with judgment, but with reverence. The question had been asked. The silence, though vast, was beginning to crack, and from beneath the frozen glass, something ancient began to breathe. In the shadowed corners of the 19th century clinic, they gathered, women whose bodies trembled without cause, whose voices broke into sobs without name, whose hearts raced as though fleeing invisible hunters. The physicians called it hysteria, catchword to mask their own unknowing. But beneath the surface symptoms, a deeper story was unfolding. These were not broken machines. They were oracles possessed not by madness, but by truths too long denied. The unconscious, unable to speak in the daylight tongue of reason, began to cry out through the flesh. The body became a scroll upon which the soul inscribed its silenced longing, its pain, its fire. Freud sat where others turned away. He did not seek to silence these women, nor to bind them further with cold diagnostics. He listened not merely to the surface words, but to the tremors beneath. He heard, through the stuttering breath and restless limbs, the voice of a great archetype long imprisoned. It was the voice of the feminine, bound in chains. An oracle once revered, now dismissed as sick, unstable, dangerous. The symptoms were not illness but rebellion, a protest against the suffocating structures that had sealed feminine desire beneath iron and stone. Desire was never the sickness. It was the repression, the centuries of forced silence, of moral denial, of disowned instincts that had twisted vitality into symptom. Jung would later speak of enantiodromia, the return of the repressed, in forms both dark and wild. Here, in these trembling bodies, the principle revealed itself. What we deny in the soul will rise in the flesh. The oracle spoke in symbols and fits, in dreams, in inexplicable anguish. To those who dared to listen, these were not signs of weakness. They were the cries of a lost wisdom, seeking to break its chains, a voice ancient as the earth, rising once more to remind the world of what it had forgotten. And so the question deepened on what is wrong with her. But what sacred truth is trying to be heard? Desire is a labyrinth, not a simple path, not a straight line toward a fixed goal, but a winding, shifting maze of instinct, longing, memory, and shadow. In the halls of culture, this maze was guarded. Female longing, when it stirred, was met with dread. It was painted as dangerous, untamable, something monstrous. The old myths echoed. The Minotaur, hidden in the depths, a beast of chaos that must be destroyed. Yet for Freud, desire was not filth, nor beast, but fire, elemental, a force that belonged neither to sign nor to pathology. He stepped into the labyrinth not as a hunter, but as a seeker of symbols. Within those winding chambers, he found the ancient layers of the feminine psyche. Desire was no single thing. It wore many faces. The Oedipal entanglements of early love and rivalry, the fierce hunger of maternal envy, seeking its rightful place, the sacred rage of a soul denied its fullness. Beneath it all, an undying flame, yearning not for suppression but for understanding. Freud's torch illuminated an architecture shaped by centuries of repression. The walls of the labyrinth were not built by nature but by stone, rule by rule, shaping what women were allowed to feel, to want, to be. In the dim corridors, he saw the cost, longing twisted into guilt, passion wrapped in shame, instinct turned against itself, and still, beneath the cold stone, the fire burned. It could not be extinguished. For desire is not a foreign interest, is a birthright woven into the very fabric of being. To pathologize it was to wound the self. To deny it was to invite the return of the repressed in darker, more destructive forms. Freud did not slay the Minotaur. He questioned the myth. Was the monster real, or was it the shadow cast by a culture afraid of the feminine soul in its full, blazing truth? Through this labyrinth of longing, the journey continues, torch in hand, eyes open, listening for the wisdom and the flame. There is a rebellion that no one sees. A war waged not in the streets or in loud protest, but in the silent chambers of the soul. When the feminine is denied her longing, when her desire, her instinct, her voice is forced beneath the surface, she does not vanish. She turns inward. But not alone. Something else begins to grow in that hollow space. Jung saw what Freud had only glimpsed. He named it the Animus, the inner masculine, shaped by culture, by father, by law. When a woman's desire is suppressed, the Animus is not a guide, becomes a tyrant, cold, sharp, condemning, a voice not her own, yet speaking from within. A chorus of old judgments. You must not want, you must not feel, you must not burn too brightly, and so begins the possession. The woman moves through life, with grace on the surface, yet beneath, the sacred temple of the psyche is in quiet revolt. She speaks to herself in the language of her oppressors. She carries their gaze in her own mind. This rebellion is not loud, but it is relentless. The anima longs to breathe, to create, to love. The possessed animus forbids it. Be small, be safe, be good, and every denial feeds the war within. This is the tragedy of the inner exile. The self turns against itself. Individuation stalls. The soul fragments. The fire of Eros dims to embers. Yet beneath it all, something endures. The longing remains not as a sin, but as a truth that refuses to be erased. To witness this silent rebellion is to see the depth of the wound and the path of healing. For until the animus is made conscious, until its voice is seen for what it is, not the self, but the mask of patriarchy, there can be no true freedom. And so, the journey turns again, deeper toward awareness, toward the naming of the inner tyrant, toward the slow, sacred unbinding of the feminine soul. The war must end, but first it must be seen. There is an ancient name that stirs in the dark. Lilith. She is not Eve. She is older, a first woman, a first breath of feminine sovereignty. And she would not kneel. She would not bow her will to the desires of another. For this, the old myths cast her out, banished her from the garden, from the ordered world of obedient roles. She became shadow, demon, the untamed force that good society would not name, but could not destroy. And so Lilith wandered, not gone, but hidden, not silenced, but exiled to the margins of consciousness. She became the rejected anima, the fierce, free feminine that patriarchal culture denied. Yet even in exile she remained. Beneath the lace of civility, beneath the careful smiles and softened speech, she pulsed. A current of wild knowing beneath the surface calm, a hunger beneath the practiced restraint. Freud's critics feared this undercurrent. They sensed, though they would not say, that his probing questions might awaken her, that beneath his theories of repression and desire lay a door to something far older, far more primal, the return of the sovereign feminine. For in every woman silenced, Lilith waits. In every longing unspoken, every instinct denied, every spark dimmed to please another, she watches, not with hatred, but with unwavering truth. She is the part of the self that will not be erased, and though culture buried her beneath centuries of shame, she remains whole. In dreams, she rises. In rage, she speaks. In moments of forbidden joy, she dances. To meet Lilith in the shadows is to reclaim what was lost, the untamed voice, the fierce love of self, the primal right to desire. It is to remember that submission was never her nature and need not be ours. In this deep turning, the anima awakens. The polite mask cracks. The denied hunger begins to speak its name, and what was once feared now begins to return. Beneath the surface of flesh and form, there lies an ancient vessel, the womb, more than an organ, more than biology. In dreams and myth, in the depths of the unconscious, it is the crucible of life, death, and transformation. Womb is an alchemical space, where the raw material of being dissolves and reforms. Desire and creation entwine here, in a dance beyond words. Yet culture, fearing its power, reduced this sacred vessel to function and duty a silent chamber of service, stripped of its mystery. But Freud saw otherwise. In his explorations of the psyche, he glimpsed the deeper truth that desire was bound to this space, not as a mere act of reproduction, but as a force of psychic renewal. To want, to create, to long for, these are not separate from the body. They are the language of the self-seeking expression through the living form. In the old alchemical texts, the philosopher's stone was said to transmute lead into gold. And so too does the womb, both literal and symbolic, transform the dark, the unknown, the unconscious into new life, new consciousness. It is a vessel where psyche meets soma, where shadow is faced and integrated, where new being is born from the depths. But when society silences this vessel, when it binds the body in shame, when it severs desire from creativity, what alchemy is lost, what potential lies dormant, waiting to be reclaimed. To see the womb in its fullness is to restore the bridge between matter and spirit, between longing and becoming. It is to honor the feminine body not as taboo, but as the seat of sacred transformation. Not merely a space to bear life, but a space where the soul itself is reborn. Here, the journey deepens. The philosopher's stone gleams beneath layers of forgetting. The vessel calls to be remembered. The fire of Eros stirs not only to create life, but to create the self anew. And so the work begins again. The alchemy of the feminine. Rising from the depths, there is a force older than civilization itself, Eros, not merely the god of carnal love, but the pulse of life, of vitality, connection, longing, and becoming. Eros is the spark that binds soul to body, one being to another, self to the world. Yet in the corridors of sterile reason, in the temples of cold orthodoxy, Eros has long been unwelcome. For where Eros moves, order trembles. The neat lines of power blur. The rigid hierarchies begin to dissolve beneath the warmth of longing and the wildness of life unfettered. As Freud's work deepened, he ventured ever closer to this sacred fire. He saw that repression of Eros was not just a personal wound, it was a collective affliction. A culture that severs itself from desire severs itself from life. And so the guardians of the old order grew fearful. Not because Freud was wrong, but because, in certain deep places, he was terribly right. He dared to speak of what they had buried. The truth that longing is not shameful, that desire is not disease, that the vitality of the feminine soul cannot be caged without cost. But the fate of those who speak the forbidden is an old one. Like Eros himself, once a revered force, later bound, diminished, and cast from the sacred city, Freud was exiled from the inner circles of respectability, not for error, but for truth that could not be tolerated. For when we chain Eros, we do not destroy it. We drive it underground, into shadow, into symptom, into the body's hidden griefs and the soul's silent hungers. The cost is paid in numbness, in fragmentation, in the loss of vitality that no reason can restore. And so the silencing of Eros echoes still, in the veiled glances, in the unshed tears, in the deep ache beneath lives lived too small. But error remains waning, a flame that flickers behind closed doors. In dreams, in the restless stirrings of the heart, what is exiled may yet return. The soul remembers, and the longing cannot be silenced forever. What is pushed beneath will rise again. What is silenced will one day scream. Jung named this sacred law of the psyche an antiodromia, the turning of one thing into its opposite. The pendulums return. The soul's fierce insistence that what is denied cannot remain buried forever. For female desire exiled, chained, made to wear the masks of sin cannot simply vanish. It coils beneath the surface, gathering force, and when the dam can no longer hold, it breaks forth not as tender longing, but as rage, as compulsion, as grief too vast for words. This is the shadow's alchemy. Desire starved of expression becomes hunger that devours. Love denied transforms into bitterness. Creativity stifled returns as despair or numbness, a hollowing of the spirit. The anima, rejected, returns not as a gentle muse but as an archetypal vengeance. In myth, we see her face, the Furies, the vengeful goddesses, the weeping queens whose sorrow blackens the land. These are not mere stories, they are mirrors of the inner world when Eros is chained too long, and so many women live this turn-in. When longing is denied its rightful voice, it twists through the corridors of the psyche. It may emerge in addictions, in endless seeking for what seems always out of reach, or in the sharp blade of self-condemnation, as the animus turns tyrant within, or in frozen numbness where no fire remains. This is not weakness, it is the inevitable alchemy of repression. The self will not tolerate exile of its deepest truths. What is denied returns tenfold until seen, until honored, until brought back into the circle of wholeness. There is danger in this return, but also possibility. For within the rage lies the original longing. Within the numbness, a spark remains. If one can walk the path with awareness, with the light of individuation, then what was once shadow may yet become strength. The feminine does not seek vengeance for its own sake. It seeks to be restored, to belong once more in the full light of being. The turning has begun. The choice now: will we listen? In the dim sanctuary of the forgotten soul, she stands, the Black Madonna, not clothed in the innocence of light, but in the velvet depths of shadow. She is the sacred mother of the buried, the disowned, the exiled truths. Her skin is dark, not as stain, but as wisdom edged with the weight of centuries, with the knowing that comes only through descent. Where Freud once knocked at the hidden door, asking, "What does a woman want?" she answers, not with theory, but with presence, with the blood and fire of what has long been denied. She is not bound by Freud's frame, nor by any man's, yet she walks through the door, his questions opened, an ancient voice rising from the depths, where the anima was once silenced. In her gaze, shame withers. In her arms, lost longing finds sanctuary. She carries not the pale purity that patriarchy has sanctified, but the full, embodied truth of the feminine soul, desire and sorrow, joy and rage, creation and destruction, all woven as one. The Black Madonna is the face of wholeness reclaimed. She speaks for the parts of womanhood long made taboo, the wild instincts, the erotic wisdom, the fierce compassion that will no longer bow to dogma. She is the mother of rebirth, of Psyche rising from its own ashes. In her presence, the ego cracks, and the deeper self stirs awake. What Freud began to awaken in theory, she embodies in living symbol, the knowing that true healing comes not from more repression, but from reverence for the full depths of being. She speaks, now, through dreams and intuition, through art and archetype, through every woman who dares to turn inward and reclaim what was lost. Her voice is not loud. It does not seek the approval of the old temples. It whispers in the heart's quiet hours. You are more than they told you. You were never meant to be small. And in that knowing, something ancient begins to rise. To speak is to transmute. To give voice to that which was once buried is an act of alchemy, of turning the raw weight of silence into the living gold of truth. And for the woman long silenced, this is no small ritual. It is a sacred work, a slow, brave unraveling of centuries. For desire, when unspeakable festers, it coils in the shadows, misunderstood even by the one who bears it. But when desire is spoken, named, honored, shaped into words, it begins to transform. It ceases to be pathology. It becomes knowing. It becomes power. Freud, in his time, sparked a small flame, a question whispered where there had been only hush. What does she want? But it is the modern woman who fans this ember into a living fire, who takes the ancient silence and forges from it a new language. Each word is a reclamation, a turning of shame into sovereignty, of numbness into feeling, of shadow into embodied presence. When a woman speaks of her longing, not as apology, not as confession, but as rightful expression, she alters the very fabric of her being. What was once fragmented begins to weave itself whole. In this alchemy of speech, the body and the psyche reunite. Sensuality sheds its chains of guilt. Truth emerges, no longer twisted to fit the mold of the acceptable. To speak of hunger, of pleasure, of grief, of rage, this is the work of rebirth. And through this act, the feminine voice ceases to be an echo of the old world. It becomes an invocation, a calling forth of a new order, one where desire is not disease but a sacred current of life. In every whispered truth, in every trembling word that rises despite fear, the old spells are broken. The long enchantment of silence begins to lift, and the woman, through her voice, reclaims her place not as an object of analysis, but as the sovereign author of her own becoming. The path of individuation winds deep through the inner forest, and at its heart lies a truth. What was exiled must return, not to reclaim dominion, not to oppose, but to restore the lost wholeness of the self. For the anima, ejected, silenced, distorted by centuries of fear, cannot remain forever in shadow. The soul knows this. The psyche longs for balance. Freud's question still echoes, what does a woman want? But perhaps it was never a question to be answered with logic or theory. It is a mirror, held up to culture's fractured soul, a reflection of what has been denied in all of us, male and female alike. To ask what does she want is to ask, what part of the self have we disowned? What longing have we silenced? What truth do we most fear to let live? And so, the journey bends toward return. Not toward the old binaries of power and subjugation, not toward a reactive reversal, but toward a greater wholeness, where the feminine and masculine within may once again speak, dance, and breathe in harmony. This is individuation, not perfection but integration. Not the erasure of difference, but the sacred weaving of opposites into a deeper unity. The anima rises not as an enemy of the old order, but as its necessary completion. She returns with her knowing of body, of longing, of intuition, of wild creation, no longer cloaked in shame, no longer bound by another's name. And so the self is reborn, not as ego triumphant, but as a vessel of deeper consciousness, a psyche in which shadow and light embrace, a soul in which desire is no longer feared, but honored as a sacred flame. In this space, Freud's old question dissolves, no longer a riddle, no longer a wound, for in the quiet heart of the integrated self, the answer was always there, not in words, but in the living fullness of being. The anima has returned, and in her return, the soul is made whole. They tried to silence him. They tried to silence her, but desire is older than their walls, older than dogma, older than shame. Desire is the first flame, the one that called life into being, the one that dances still in the hidden chambers of the soul. It cannot be buried, it cannot be extinguished, for even beneath stone, beneath centuries of forgetting, the ember waits. Freud, flawed and human, struck a spark, a question that would not die. And though they sought to quench it, though they buried him beneath controversy, the flame remained alive in the unconscious, alive in the dreaming feminine who would not be contained. And now can you feel it? In the voice of every woman reclaiming her body, in the words trembling on the tongue that was once taught to stay silent, in the fierce softness of the mother, the lover, the mystic, the creator, each one tending the ancient fire. This is no longer his story alone, nor hers alone. It is a flame passed through countless hands, through bloodlines and broken chains, and still it burns in the poetry of the body remembered, in the art born of long-hidden longing, in the knowing gaze that meets itself in the mirror, and no longer turns away. Desire transforms, from hunger into voice, from exile into homecoming, from shadow into light. The old temples crumble, the sterile theories fade, but deep within, in the sacred hearth of the soul, something eternal remains, the flame of life, of longing, of the self-seeking wholeness. This is the truth they could not silence. This is the fire that will not die, and as long as there is breath, as long as there is one heart brave enough to feel, one voice brave enough to speak, this flame will rise, a light in the dark, a torch passed forward, a remembrance that what burns in the unconscious will one day awaken the world.